The general's description painted a picture of suffering that most of the assembled soldiers couldn't imagine enduring, let alone overcoming. She carried the radio operator on her back. Sterling continued his voice, carrying the reverence reserved for describing acts of heroism that transcended normal human capability. Dragged the wounded soldier on a makeshift stretcher that she constructed from broken backpack straps and whatever materials she could salvage from their destroyed equipment. No help coming, no air support possible due to weather conditions. Just pure determination and the kind of will that separates heroes from ordinary people. The assembled soldiers began to understand that they were hearing about someone who had redefined the limits of human endurance and courage. Maya's mind had drifted back to those 8 days of hell, to a place where there was no formation, no lines of soldiers, no Jake Morrison running his mouth about things he couldn't understand. In her memory, there was only blood in the snow, only the sound of her own breath getting weaker with each passing hour. Only the weight of 2 dying men whose survival depended entirely on her ability to keep moving when every instinct screamed for her to stop. She could still hear the voice of the radio operator, barely conscious, but somehow finding the strength to whisper, "If I pass out, don't stop. Just keep walking." She did exactly that. Sterling's voice cut through Maya's memories, like a blade bringing her back to the present moment, where she stood surrounded by soldiers who were finally beginning to understand who she really was. Even when she could barely see through exhaustion and pain, even when she had to crawl the last 300 yards with both men on her back because standing was no longer physically possible, she brought them home because that's what real soldiers do. They don't leave people behind no matter the cost to themselves. The general's voice carried the weight of absolute conviction as he addressed the assembled soldiers. "You think she came back to Fort Blackwater for fame, for recognition, for some kind of glory that would make her suffering worthwhile?" His questions were rhetorical, but they forced every soldier present to confront their own assumptions about heroism and service. She came back because she remembers what happens when soldiers aren't properly trained, when they're not prepared for the reality of combat, when they think military service is some kind of game or adventure. So she volunteered to come back. Sterling's voice carried a note of amazement that someone who had endured such trauma would choose to return to military service. She asked for the hardest job we have, training instructor for new recruits who think they understand what it means to be a soldier. That means all of you. The general's words hit the assembled soldiers like physical blows, forcing them to confront the reality that their behavior toward Maya had not just been cruel, but profoundly disrespectful to someone who had earned the right to their respect through sacrifices they couldn't imagine. Every soldier standing in that formation now realized that Maya Stanley wasn't some broken warrior trying to hang on to past glory. She was a leader who had chosen to return to service in order to teach the next generation what real strength looked like. She hadn't come back with stories and speeches, but with scars that told truths about courage and sacrifice that couldn't be learned from textbooks or training manuals. Her silence wasn't weakness. It was the disciplined strength of someone who had learned that actions spoke louder than words, that real heroes didn't need to announce their credentials. Jake Morrison's face had gone through a complete transformation during Sterling's recitation, shifting from confusion to understanding to something approaching genuine horror as the implications of his behavior became clear. Even the boldest among them looked away. Sterling observed his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority, not in fear, not in guilt, but in something far more rare on a training field. Respect for someone who had earned it through blood and sacrifice, rather than demanding it through rank or position. And the assembled soldiers now understood that they had been in the presence of military legend without recognizing her, that their cruel laughter and casual dismissal had been directed at someone whose courage and sacrifice had redefined the meaning of military service. Maya Stanley was number 27, the survivor who carried the names and faces of 26 fallen comrades, the woman who had proven that real strength came not from dominating others, but from the willingness to sacrifice everything for the people under your command. Sometimes leadership doesn't come wrapped in medals, Sterling concluded. Sometimes it looks like a woman with bruised arms, a tight jaw, and fire in her silence. Someone who chose to come back when she could have walked away. The general's words would echo in every soldier's mind, forcing them to reconsider everything they knew about strength and heroism. But will Jake pay the ultimate price for his cruelty? BD Stories reveals the shocking consequences next. Type justice if you think Jake deserves what's coming. The aftermath of General Sterling's revelation settled over Fort Blackwater like dust after an explosion, leaving everyone changed by what they had witnessed. Jake Morrison walked off the training field with his head hung low, his shoulders curved inward as if trying to make himself smaller, his earlier swagger completely absent. The silence that followed him was more devastating than any shouted condemnation could have been. It was the quiet of people who had witnessed something that fundamentally altered their understanding of honor and disgrace. No one clapped for his departure, no one sneered at his retreat, and that absence of reaction was somehow louder than any noise could have been. Within hours, Jake's humiliation became complete. as the consequences of his actions spread through the military community with the speed of wildfire. His phone, which had been intended to capture Maya's breakdown for social media fame, instead contained a permanent record of his own spectacular failure to understand the true nature of strength and service. Other soldiers who had witnessed his cruelty began to distance themselves from him, recognizing that association with someone who had attacked a military legend would permanently damage their own reputations. The videos he had planned to use for viral fame became evidence of his profound ignorance and cruelty. Jake's exile from the military community was swift and absolute. His requests for transfers were expedited with unusual efficiency, and within days he found himself reassigned to a remote post where his reputation had not yet preceded him. But even there, the story of his confrontation with Widow 27 followed him like a shadow whispered in conversations that stopped when he entered rooms referenced in evaluations that would ensure his military career remained permanently stunted. No one said goodbye when he left Fort Blackwater, and his absence was noted only by the improvement in the training environment that his departure created. Maya Stanley's response to Jake's downfall was characteristically professional and restrained. She didn't gloat over his humiliation, didn't seek additional punishment for his behavior, didn't even acknowledge that anything significant had happened. Instead, she continued her training duties with the same quiet dignity she had maintained throughout his campaign of harassment. Her silence in victory was somehow more powerful than any vengeful speech could have been demonstrating, the kind of grace under pressure that separated true leaders from those who merely commanded through fear or intimidation. The atmosphere at Fort Blackwater underwent a complete transformation in the days following Sterling's revelation. Soldiers who had previously ignored Maya or participated in Jake's mockery now found themselves paying attention to her every movement, studying her technique, and listening carefully to her rare instructions. They began to understand that they were in the presence of someone who had redefined the limits of human endurance and courage, someone whose quiet professionalism masked depths of experience that most of them would never approach. Training sessions that had once been characterized by casual joking and relaxed attitudes became focused and intense as soldiers recognized that they were being instructed by someone who had earned her knowledge through trials that most people wouldn't survive. Maya's demonstrations of combat techniques carried the weight of a real-world experience. Her corrections of their mistakes came from an understanding of what happened when training failed in actual combat situations. The bruises and scars they had once mocked became visible reminders of the price of service and the reality of military life. Later that evening, the mess hall at Fort Blackwater buzzed with its usual quiet rhythm of conversation and clinking silverware, but something fundamental had shifted in the social dynamics of the facility. The conversations were more subdued, more respectful, as if the soldiers were finally beginning to understand that their comfortable assumptions about military life had been shattered by the revelation of who Maya Stanley really was. Nobody laughed too loudly or filled the air with meaningless chatter because they now knew that real heroes walked among them, and such presence demanded a different kind of respect. In the back corner of the mess hall, at a table designed for 6 people, Maya Stanley sat alone as she had every evening since her arrival at Fort Blackwater. Her posture remained unchanged, straight-backed and alert, her movements methodical and economical as she ate her meal in silence. She appeared to be someone who had never expected company and had learned not to need it, but something subtle had changed in the atmosphere around her. The isolation that had once seemed like rejection now felt more like the respectful distance that people maintained around someone whose sacrifices had earned them a different kind of recognition. The transformation began gradually, almost imperceptibly, as individual soldiers made the decision to approach Maya's table. There was no fanfare, no dramatic speeches, no formal acknowledgement of what had transpired on the training field. Instead, there were just quiet footsteps on the mess hall floor, the soft sound of trays being placed on tables, the gentle scrape of chairs being pulled out. A younger recruit sat down first, his movements careful and respectful, followed by another soldier and then 2 more. None of them spoke as they joined Maya at her table. They didn't offer apologies for their previous behavior, didn't try to explain or justify their earlier dismissal of her worth. Instead, they simply sat down and began eating their meals in companionable silence, their eyes occasionally glancing toward Maya with something that was neither pity nor guilt but recognition. They had finally begun to see her not as the bruised and silent figure they had initially dismissed, but as the woman who had refused to break even when she had every excuse to surrender. The soldiers now understood that they were in the presence of someone who had earned her reputation through actions rather than words, someone who had proven her worth through sacrifice rather than self-promotion. Maya Stanley was a soldier who didn't need to brag about her combat experiences, didn't demand special treatment based on her heroic actions, and didn't require praise or recognition to validate her service. She had earned her place through the kind of quiet competence that spoke louder than any medal or commendation could. As the evening progressed, one of the newer recruits leaned forward slightly, his voice barely above a whisper, as he asked the question that had been haunting all of them. "Why Widow 27?" The question hung in the air between them, carrying the weight of genuine curiosity rather than mockery or disrespect. Maya didn't look up from her meal, didn't change her expression, didn't pause in her methodical consumption of her dinner. "Because I've buried 26 of my team," she replied, her voice carrying the even tone of someone stating a simple fact. "I'm number 27. The words fell into the silence around the table, like stones dropped into still water, creating ripples of understanding that would continue to spread long after the conversation ended. The table went completely still, every soldier present recognizing that they had just heard something that would change their understanding of service and sacrifice forever. No one asked a second question, no one sought additional details, and no one tried to probe deeper into Maya's experiences. The silence that followed her words wasn't uncomfortable or awkward. It was reverent, the kind of quiet that accompanied the presence of something sacred. Every soldier at that table understood that they would never forget what those words meant, that they had been privileged to hear a truth that most people would never encounter. That night, no one made speeches about heroism or sacrifice. No one told Maya thank you or tried to express gratitude for her service. But they didn't need to use words to communicate their respect and understanding. They had shown up at her table, they had stayed despite the emotional weight of her revelation, and they had listened to her truth without judgment or expectation. For the first time since she had returned to Fort Blackwater, Maya Stanley didn't eat alone. What would you do if you discovered your biggest bully was actually a war hero? Type respect. If this story changed how you see people with scars. The story of Maya Stanley and Jake Morrison spread through military circles, like ripples in a pond, becoming a cautionary tale about the danger of making assumptions about people based on their appearance or circumstances. Maya continued her work as a training instructor, her quiet professionalism and hard-earned wisdom, helping to shape a new generation of soldiers who understood that true strength came not from dominating others, but from the willingness to sacrifice everything for the people under your command. Jake Morrison's military career never recovered from his encounter with Widow 27. His story became a reminder that in the military, as in life, respect must be earned through actions rather than demanded through position or attitude. The videos he had intended to use for viral fame became evidence of his profound failure to understand the true nature of heroism and service. But perhaps the most important lesson from that morning at Fort Blackwater was about the power of silence and the strength that comes from enduring rather than retaliating. Maya Stanley had proven that sometimes the most powerful response to cruelty is not anger or revenge, but the quiet dignity of someone who knows their own worth and doesn't need validation from others to prove it. Her scars, which had once been targets for mockery, became symbols of courage and sacrifice that inspired everyone who encountered her story. And in a world that often celebrates noise and aggression, Maya Stanley stood as a testament to the truth that real strength bleeds in silence, trains without praise, and stares down cowards until they remember what the word respect actually means. The 26 names on her dog tags would never be forgotten, and Maya Stanley, number 27, the survivor, the one who carried their memory forward, would continue to honor their sacrifice by teaching others what it truly meant to serve with honor, courage, and unwavering dedication to something greater than themselves. If this story touched your heart, hit that like button. It helps us share more incredible tales of hidden heroes. And if you'd like to support our mission of bringing these powerful stories to light, there's a link in the description. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you in the next story, where ordinary people reveal extraordinary courage.
Still here? You're one of us now. Subscribe to BD Stories and binge like your group chat depends on it.